Hi, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Falk, and in this video we're going to paint another Panzerknacker by PanzerArt. But this time we'll do the exact opposite of what we did last time. If you've watched the last video, you know that I tried to find a way to paint miniatures fast and simple, while still achieving as much quality as possible. And judging from your comments and the insane amount of views that video received, I'd say you liked the result just as much as I did. But I also got a few comments saying that the technique I showed last time might be a bit too simple, or feels a bit too much like a paint by numbers project. And I'm fine with that. Like I said, I wanted to show an easy method that, at least in my opinion, looks a lot better than the classic base coat, all over wash and then highlight approach. Today, I hope I can satisfy those of you who thought the last paint job was too simple. And if you like this speed paint video, watch this one anyway. I'm pretty sure it's great for all skill levels, and you might even pick up a thing or two to improve your own projects. I'm sure I've said this before. From time to time I also enjoy painting sci-fi or fantasy miniatures. And I love looking at painted busts and single display pieces. I also do quite a bit of oil painting, mostly portraits. And one thing I really enjoy across all those forms of art is playing with light and shadow. And a couple of weeks ago I finally asked myself, why are light and shadow so often completely neglected in scale modeling? Almost every model, diorama and figure I've seen in my not so long career of scale modeling uses the same classic zenithal approach. The light comes from directly above and that's it. There are no interesting light directions. Our models always stand outside on a sunny but slightly cloudy day around noon. Of course, I get that this setup might be the best choice for a single model. It would look odd to paint one side of a tank much darker than the other, but as soon as that single model is placed in a diorama, that could actually become an option. Placing your model in a diorama often creates a golden angle anyway, so why not use that to also create a more interesting light setup? Up to this day though, I've never been brave enough to try it. And the simple reason is, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time only to realize in the end that I messed up completely. So let's try this concept on a smaller scale to get a feel for it. And that's why I decided to paint another PanzerArt miniature. This guy looks really cool. I already had him assembled and the amount of work looked manageable. Alright, let's finally start talking about what I did here. As you can see, I started out with my favorite Mr. Surfacer in black and then gave the model a really subtle zenithal all around using AK Real Color White. I then sprayed a few more coats of white from the left at about a 30 to 45 degree angle. I tried to find a balance between a more interesting light setup while still showing all the details. So this figure might be placed in the morning sun after sunrise, since I didn't want to add a lot of red and orange colors. But also, the sun is still quite far away from its highest position. Since I already knew I wanted to create a scene on a clear winter day, I expected quite a bit of bounce light from the environment. And since the sun is a pretty powerful light source, there was no need to keep the shadow side too dark. He won't be standing in the dungeon after all. The white pre-shading serves a couple of different purposes here. First of all, it helps me spot defects and mold lines on the Mini that I might have missed during assembly. It also looks nicer on video. A pre-shaded miniature reads better against my dark background and makes it much easier for you to see everything. And there's another really important reason. You can use it to cheat a bit. When you take pictures of the Mini after pre-shading, you can reference them while painting to spot all the shadow and highlight areas. When taking those pictures, make sure to have a consistent light setup. If you're taking your pictures next to a window and turn the figure around, it might be harder in the end to identify the different areas. And yes, I know, I used the word cheating, but honestly, that's a totally valid technique. Artists rarely work without reference. When I do a portrait, I work from a picture, or I can look at my model sitting next to my canvas. And of course I would use lights to illuminate the person the way I want. The same goes for still lifes or even landscapes. And getting a feel for light and shadow takes time and practice. But with reference pictures, you can make your life a whole lot easier. So let's talk about the painting you see on screen. As usual, I heavily relied on my trusty AK Interactive 3rd Gen acrylic paints. The heavy lifting was done by the Wehrmacht Field Grey uniform set, which includes all the paints you need to create a nice looking field grey uniform, in both the greenish and the blue-grey version. However, I like to switch up my paint schemes a bit to create more interest, especially if there's more than one figure in a project. For the green parts, for example, I added quite a bit of medium green to get more saturation. And in a later step I even glazed in a bit of pure medium green to make it pop even more. For this project I also used large amounts of snow blue to create my highlights. Using a color like snow blue instead of a pure white helps to keep the saturation up. Adding white to your paints often creates a chalky look, which I like to avoid. And once again, I had the environment for this figure in mind. Clear day, blue sky, bounce light from the melting snow around him, so snow blue was the perfect fit. Of course, there are a lot of different paints you could use for the same effect in different environments. For a sunny summer day, for example, I'd use something like ice yellow or sunny skin tone to mix my highlights. You might also have noticed that this time there are no overlays showing which colors I used in this video. Simple reason, I can't really tell you in detail. Like I said, I used mostly the colors from the uniform set, but I don't have fixed mixing ratios. I put all those paints on my wet palette and mix everything together over time in a big puddle. Sounds horrible, but it works great for me. And it also helps to create more interest through slight color shifts. For painting his pants and jacket, I used two different approaches. The pants were base coated with German grey, my darkest color for the pants, and then I started sketching in the highlights and blended everything together over time. I began with the part of the pants that receives the most light, but also has dark shadows on the inside where less light reaches. This way I could establish my value range right from the start. I paint my lightest and darkest tones first, and then I know what values I can use in between. So I often finish a specific area almost completely before moving on to the next. When the first one is done, I pick the next and finish that one almost completely as well. But often there comes a point where I start jumping between areas if I notice spots that need adjusting or feel more interesting for me to paint. This approach was really helpful on this miniature to make sure there's a noticeable difference in the values. For example, comparing the highlights in the front to the highlight areas in the back. For the jacket, I started with the uniform grey-green type as a base coat and then sketched in shadows and highlights. Honestly, I can't really tell you why I switched approaches at that point, but for some reason it felt more natural. And both ways obviously work fine. Another paint that played a key role for this figure is brown-black, which I used for almost all the shadows. And there's this rule in painting that it's a good idea to combine cold highlights like my snow blue with warm shadows and vice versa. And that way you create even more contrast and interest on your miniature. At this point I was also a bit unsure about the overall brightness and contrast of the miniature. The cold and quite bright pre-shading can make it harder to judge your values and the overall look. There are two solutions to this. The best one is trust the process. If you know your paint combinations worked before, there's no good reason they should fail you this time. The other solution would be to quickly base coat all the unpainted areas, so you get a better feel for the figure. Another important topic is blending in texture. I like to create fairly smooth blends on those larger uniform areas. When establishing the colors, I often wet blend the paints or feather out a color with a second slightly damp brush. In the later steps, I then switch to glazing to get slight color shifts with every layer. That technique makes it easy to control the intensity of the paint, but it does take a bit more time and practice. On other parts of his gear, I used a lot of stipple glazing, for example on the water bottle. Stipple glazing is probably the easiest way to create smooth transitions, but you can also use stippling to create a rougher texture, which helps sell the look of different materials. The most fun part for me on this project was painting all the cast shadows. When painting, you can distinguish between shallow areas that receive less light because of their overall position and cast shadows that appear because there's an actual object between the light source and the surface. And yes, I know technically all shadows are cast shadows, but for explaining this concept, it's easier to separate the two. Adding those shadows, especially the large one on the back caused by the anti-tank mines he is carrying, might feel and look a bit weird. But in the end, I think it works much better than hoping for natural shadows to appear. This also gives you the chance to add highlights where light sneaks in, so you can really control which areas you want almost hidden and which you want to show. The sad thing about painting cast shadows is that most people won't notice them. Light behaves differently on miniatures this small because the sun or even most artificial light sources are quite large compared to the mini, so there often isn't enough shadow. That's also why we paint shadows and highlights in the first place. And if you paint these cast shadows correctly, they obviously fall in areas where shadows would naturally occur. Our brains will recognize them as shadows because that's where they should be. So I guess you'll just have to tell people you actually painted those shadows. Another fun way to show the work you put into them is to turn the model upside down and point out that the shadows are still visible. And I guess I don't really need to explicitly point them out since you already saw me paint them, but I'll do it anyway. After this video ends, click the link in the description to go to my Patreon page. There are a few high quality pictures available for free, so you can take a closer look at all those nice cast shadows. And if you want to see even more pictures of this figure, the cast shadows and all the other models I've created for this channel, maybe even consider supporting me on Patreon. These videos and projects take a lot of time to create, and your support there would help me a lot in creating more and larger projects for this channel. In return, you'll get regular workbench updates, ad-free videos, high quality pictures, and the 3D printable models I create for this channel. I also want to take a moment to thank you all for your amazing support. If you enjoy this kind of content, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and tell me in the comments which part you enjoyed most. And if you want to support me even more, maybe share this video with your scale modeling friends so we can grow this channel even further. And of course, a special thanks to all the lovely people that already support me on Patreon. You guys keep this channel running and I'm really grateful for your support. Thank you so much. Let's start working on the smaller details. My first idea was to paint his belt, holster and map pouch as black leather, so I base coated them all with a solid black. Later I decided to change the map pouch to a nice brown after looking at a few reference images. It looks a lot better and creates more variety. For the black leather I used only two paints. I started out with rubber black and then added more and more snow blue to create the highlights. Painting shiny black leather is almost the same approach for me as painting non-metallic metal. I wanted to create leather that is barely scratched. That means that there isn't much surface texture visible in 1/35 scale, so these pouches are mostly solid black, with only a small amount of lighter paint on the larger areas. For a shiny look, it's important to paint really sharp highlights. There's only a small amount of blending between the shadow and highlight areas, and the highlight areas themselves are quite small. Of course, I also use pure snow blue for my edge highlights to make the details stand out even with so much black. And I guess I forgot to explain why I use rubber black. Rubber black isn't completely black. It's slightly lighter, more grayish, and looks more interesting in my opinion. It's also a bit warmer than pure black and contrasts nicely with the snow blue. For his map pouch, I started with a base coat of Waffen red brown, and then I added light earth and a bit of snow blue for highlights. For the shadows, I used burnt umber by scale 75. I wasn't really happy with the look of the pouch and couldn't figure out why. But later, after most of the figure was painted, I had the opportunity to talk to Eric Swinson, one of the miniature painters I look up to. And Eric suggested adding a bit more color since light earth had desaturated the red too much. So I used orange tan and orange brown to show the actual wear on the pouch. I worked around the edges and also painted a bunch of fine scratches all over. After I was happy with the result, I added highlights once again with snow blue. So Eric, thank you so much for your feedback. And in case you guys don't know his work, check it out on Instagram and also check his YouTube channel where he posts really nice in-depth tutorials for fantasy and sci-fi miniatures. For the wooden handles of his potato meshers, I used my scale 75 artist acrylics. Whenever I have to paint wood, those are my go-to paints since they stay wet much longer than most acrylics, making it really easy to blend and create subtle texture. If you'd like to see a more detailed explanation of my wood painting process, I already have a couple of videos showing this in detail on larger surfaces, which makes it much easier to demonstrate. Check out the Eosan painting video, the FW190 painting video, or the FW diorama video. For the metallic parts of the grenades, I used German grey as a base color. German grey is almost always my go-to base for steel surfaces. Once again, I used brown black for shadows, and for highlights I mixed in small amounts of silver grey and snow blue. I like using the non-metallic metal approach on miniatures like this, because it gives me more control over the light. Metallic paints work too, but since they are reflective, the highlights shift their position depending on the actual light shining on your miniature. And since we've spent quite a bit of time creating a specific light situation, the non-metallic metal approach is, in my opinion, the better option. I also used the same paints in different ratios on his belt buckle and other metallic parts. As you can see, it's also no problem to create different types of metal using just those few paints. And for something small and reflective like the belt buckle, pure white can also be an option to create an even brighter reflection. Small metallic parts like this are a great opportunity for your first non-metallic metal experiments, since there's no need for extremely smooth blends. For his spread back, I used medium green as a base coat, and then mixed in darker greens and brown black for shadows with snow blue for highlights. If you look up reference images for these spreadbacks, you'll see a ton of different versions. The color shifted over production runs, and they often used whatever material was available. And that's great for us, because it means we can get more variety, especially when there's more than one figure carrying a bag like that. And maybe I'll upset some of you with this, but I don't really care for strict color accuracy. We don't truly know how the stuff looked fresh out of the factory 80 years ago. There might have been a lot of fading and shifting in color. Combine that with the fact that at some point nobody in the factory cared too much about exact colors, I think there are more than enough reasons to focus on painting something that looks cool rather than something that is color accurate compared to one specific photo in one specific light situation. And there's another technique I want to briefly cover: blacklining. Blacklining works similar to a pin wash on a scale model. I use diluted acrylic paint in a very dark color, in this case brown black, burnt umber and pure black. I use it to paint very thin lines around individual details to get more contrast and make everything more readable. For me, blacklining is something I do along the way while painting the Mini, but you could also do it at the very end. I prefer doing it as I go, because it's easier to correct dark lines that might get a bit too white. Again, this is one of those techniques that can push your miniature to the next level, but it does take a bit of practice. Haven't done non-metallic metal in a while, right? So let's add a bit more of that to a gas mask canister. For this detail I had to keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, there's a lot of shadow on the top side because it's sitting right under those anti-tank mines. But once again, if you take reference pictures, you should be fine. But there also had to be bright highlights. When you're painting shadows and highlights, you also need to keep the material in mind that you're trying to render. A dull cloth material might not have a bright highlight because it's not very reflective. On the other hand, something like this metal canister, which was coated with glossy enamel paint, is quite reflective, so you might get a pretty bright highlight even in an area that's in shadow. My approach to something like this is usually pretty simple. I just play around with the intensity until it looks cool. And when in doubt, I go a bit brighter, since I prefer that over a darker, more muted look. And now, it's finally time for stipple glazing. These water bottles had a felt cover, and I like to recreate this look by stippling my shadows and highlights on. For stippling in general, you don't want your paint to be too runny, otherwise you might get stains and tite marks rather than really small dots. However, there are situations where you might actually want this look. I use it for corroded zinc plated surfaces, for example. Once again, I used my base color and then mixed in brown, black, light earth and a bit of snow blue and stippled those on. The great thing about stippling is that it's really easy to control the brightness and intensity of your colors with this technique. It's also pretty easy to go back and forth in case you mess up an area. But it's obviously not the most time efficient way. For the leather straps and the bottle cap, I once again used my approach for black leather. The cap of his bottle was also metal, but as far as I know, those were coated with black enamel paint, so I figured a black reflective surface would fit pretty well. Another small tip I've kept secret until now is that when painting black leather, I often mix a bit of gloss varnish into my black base coat. Matte black paint often looks a lot lighter than glossy black. So in case you want something to be really black and dark, a bit of gloss varnish might do the trick here. I also like to create contrast by using different types of varnish. It can look pretty cool to have a glossy surface next to a matte one. By the way, this doesn't apply to a glossy look of acrylic washes on a matte paint job. That just looks horrible. In that case, you really should use a matte varnish. But of course, it's also fine to not care about the opinion of some random guy on the internet. Painting the fur hood on his coat was something I didn't look forward to, since I wasn't really sure how to approach it. I decided to not care about the texture in the beginning. So I used a bunch of grey paints and established the general light and shadow areas, keeping the large shapes in mind. When I was happy with the large shapes, I then went in and started to highlight the individual bumps that are sculpted onto the miniature. You could probably also dry brush something like this, but since all the surrounding areas were already painted, dry brushing felt a bit risky to me. I also tried to use an enamel wash to get more contrast around the sculpted texture, but that looked pretty bad, since a lot of the dark wash ended up in the highlight areas, so I removed it completely. And unfortunately, I can't show you much footage of me painting his wooden stick and his glove, since those parts were so small that my camera had a really hard time keeping them in focus. But as you probably expected, I used my Scale 75 artist acrylics for the wood, and the process for the glove was similar to the one I used for the fur parts. First I established the general forms, and then I painted in a lot of small dots, both as highlights and to show the texture of the knitted glove. Then I started to work on the anti-tank mines, and that was really fun. Since those are technical objects with sharp lines and flat surfaces, they felt more like painting a larger model rather than painting a figure. So I used the same approach I would use on a vehicle. They had already received pre-shading in the beginning, so I decided to make use of that. I sprayed heavily diluted German yellow, so the pre-shading was still visible. But of course this didn't create enough contrast, so I went in with my brush and painted brighter highlights and even more cast shadows. The mine sitting on top casts a pretty dark shadow onto the lower one. With light colors like German yellow, there's always the risk that shadows won't be dark enough. So I glazed a couple of layers of black-brown over the mine and recreated that shadow that was already suggested by the pre-shading. And I really enjoyed looking at this footage while editing. It looks completely weird and it also felt weird to paint that on. But when I look at the miniature standing next to me, I'd say it worked out pretty well. And since those mines have nice and defined edges, I also used the pin wash to create a bit more contrast. Plus, I also enjoy doing pin washes. After the mines were done, it was finally time to start painting his face. And I love painting faces. Painting faces is a huge topic, and if you enjoyed this brief explanation and would like to see an in-depth version, please let me know in the comments. Once again, I don't like to use the base coat wash highlight approach. Instead, I use more or less the same process I would use when painting on canvas. First of all, I rarely use ready-made skin tones. Don't get me wrong, using them is perfectly fine, and there are situations where it's a lot more convenient. But I often prefer to mix my own on my wet palette. I usually start with a bunch of random colors. Different browns, reds, a bit of yellow, maybe some green, and of course something like snow blue for the highlights. In most cases I use the Scale 75 Artist Acrylics because, as I said, I like that they stay wet for a longer time. And then I mix myself a dark base coat. Take a dark brownish red and add a bit of white, and you get a skin tone that looks perfectly suited for someone who's either a pig or just ran a marathon. So I added a bit of green, blue or yellow to shift it to a more natural skin color. The great thing about skin tones is that you can't really go wrong. There are so many variations, and if you don't have a specific reference, you can mix up whatever you like. I do, however, like to use portrait references at this point to get a better feeling for the skin tone I want to achieve. It's less about shadow and highlight placement and more about the zones of color that you can see when looking at a face. I then block in the darker shadows and often leave the lighter areas unpainted at first. Then I mix in more and more light paints into my first mixture to create midtones and highlights. Sometimes I'd also go in the other direction. If a shadow area feels too light, I mix in something like a dark purple or dark brown to deepen it. And from there I slowly build up my highlights. On faces this small I quickly get to a point where I thin down my paint quite a bit and work mostly with glazes to get a smooth blended surface. When my initial base coats are done and the general features are established, I start to glaze more interesting colors over the base. For example, when you look at a face, especially one that's out in the cold, you can clearly see red tones around the nose and cheeks. So I glaze a bit of red there. I also glazed some greyish purple around the chin and jawline to add subtle shadow and suggest a bit of facial hair. If you want to create a heavier stubble look, you can simply glaze in more of those tones. I also made sure all my shadows were dark enough. Once again, I had to think about my light direction. One side of his face is almost completely in shadow because of its head position. This also shifted many highlights quite far from where you'd normally expect them. I also cheated in a bit of light on his left cheekbone. In my reference images, that area was pretty dark, but it would have looked boring to keep one whole side of his face so dark. So I painted in a few subtle highlights to define the shape better. In miniature painting, we often have to exaggerate values and colors for a more appealing result, and I'm completely fine with that. And one last note about painting faces. When doing the eyes, please, for the love of God, don't use pure white and black. Use a light grey or off-white for the eyeball and something like a dark blue for the pupil. Eyes in reality are far from pure white and black, and that also looks pretty odd on miniatures. And in case you notice that the face you're seeing now looks different from the one I just painted, you're right. I painted this face in the morning, and later that evening I decided I didn't like the skin tone, so I repainted him. I didn't bother recording it because I used the exact same process and paints, just shifted the colors slightly. Time for the last missing details. His helmet received a winter whitewash. On something bigger like a tank, I guess I would first paint the normal color, then add chipping fluid and finally apply a coat of white that then can be chipped. But for something small like this helmet, this wasn't really necessary. I used a mix of white and off-white paints to create the base coat. Once again, paying attention to shadow and highlight areas, so I could make slight adjustments. Like on the guy standing in front of my Erosan I made a while ago, reddish grey was my go-to paint to add shadows to the cold white. And after I was happy with the white, I carefully painted a few chips with German grey and then added some silver grey spots inside those chips to simulate areas where even the base paint of the helmet was removed down to the bare metal. And for his boots, I used the same approach as for his brown map pouch. Once again, stippling the paint rather than applying smooth layers to create some texture. And of course, I also added a bit of weathering to this guy. For that I prefer to use my AK enamel effects. Having the option to almost completely remove the paint with a bit of mineral spirits without harming the acrylic paint underneath is a great thing. And as you can see, I stippled small amounts of paint in areas where I would expect dirt and then blended it with mineral spirits. I like to add weathering like this layer by layer to slowly build up the effect. When you let the individual layers of enamel paint dry completely, they are able to resist the thinner when blending the next layer, and since I don't like to wait, I use a hairdryer for that. I also made sure to take a note of which enamel paints I used for the weathering on the figure, so I could later use them for the small base as well. And also once again, I made sure to create a contrast between more glossy areas caused by the fresh mud enamel paint that is quite glossy compared to the more matte and satin areas like his pants. To be honest, I prefer the clean figure compared to the weathered one. Weathering looks cool and is great for hiding your crimes. But in this case I felt there were no crimes that needed to be hidden. But of course, a guy like this standing next to a blown up tank in a muddy field probably wouldn't be that clean anyway, right? And I wanted to keep the story consistent, so he had to be a bit muddy. And after this guy is now finally done, I will spend exactly 5 minutes to show you how I created the base. My original idea was to take only 90 seconds for this, but it turned out that I was able to spend quite a lot of time on a base this small, so there's a lot of footage I have to show you. Fortunately, I already had a plinth ready. This is a 5cm beach rod that I cut to length and painted black. A very simple solution, but for a quick and simple project like this, perfectly fine. I also used masking tape to protect the sides from paint splatters, overspray and fingerprints. Step number 1 was to apply a bit of AK's wet ground texture. I like to use this as a base coat for my VMS Smart Mud. Smart Mud often has a hard time sticking to a smooth surface like this plinth, and the texture paint is perfect for solving that issue. Doesn't matter which texture paint you use, as long as it's gritty. And wet ground was the one I could reach without getting up from my chair, so I used that. I then applied the Smart Mud over it and brought it into shape. While it was still wet, I added a bit of common earth from crowd cover, some gravel and dried seagrass to create more texture and make it look more realistic. I also added a piece of track that I found in my bits box and pressed it into the Smart Mud. Won't tell you which tank this belongs to, so you can head over to the comments and make a guess about that. I think I told you before that composition wise it's always a great idea to add a vertical element to a base or diorama. but since he's standing on a muddy winter meadow or field, there wasn't an obvious solution like a street lamp as in my last project. So I used the piece of track as a vertical element, and since there's no rule stating that vertical elements always have to point skyward, I let the track hang down the side of the base. And I have to say, in my opinion, this looks pretty cool, and also does a great job of breaking up the uniformity. And of course I also placed a bunch of grass tufts and flowers on the base for a bit of vegetation. I then, as usual, primed everything black and once again sprayed the zenithal to see where shadows would occur. After that, I started by painting the flowers. I used various shades of dunkelgelb, dark yellow to create the look of plants during the winter time. Of course, I also did a bit of post shading to add more variety. I like to start by painting plants and grass because you often get a lot of overspray on the surrounding ground. But I don't mind that bit of overspray from my earth color onto the plants, so this order works best for me. When the basic airbrushing was done, I came in with 3 or 4 enamel earth paints that I blended together using heavy amounts of enamel thinner. These are also the paints I used to add dirt stains to the Panzerknacker itself. Since I wanted to show a specific light situation, I also made sure to apply the correct shadows. And because it's a muddy winter scene with melting snow, I also applied a bit of wet effects fluid to areas that looked a bit too dry. Painting the tracks took quite some time, but I wanted to try some non-metallic metal effects on them as well. First of all, tracks usually have a dark steel color and some surface texture, so I started out by stippling German grey all over and then moved into the highlighting process. And the areas where the tracks come into contact with the road wheels and the outer edge often get polished and they can become pretty shiny. However, since this tank was driving through the mud before it hit a mine laid by our Panzerknacker, the tracks also had to be muddy. So once again I got into a situation where I had to repaint a part. The first version of the tracks had really shiny contact areas, but those looked way too bright and out of place. They also took attention away from our miniature, and that's not what I wanted. So I dialed the contact areas down a bit and added mud and dirt to integrate them into the groundwork. I started out with a layer of AK stirred earth, mixed with weathering plaster to add some texture, and then once again came in with my enamel earth effects. I also did a bunch of splattering with my earth colors and added a few tiny rust speckles for a bit more variety. Last but not least, I finished up with 2 layers of AK snow sprinkles. Those snow sprinkles are quite shiny and a perfect representation of wet, melting snow compared to the more fluffy snow texture paste. I finished up with a warning sign that didn't save the tank because it's written in German rather than Cyrillic letters. And that's it. Once again, thank you all for watching, leave a like, write a comment and maybe even check out my Patreon page. And a special thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Hope to see you all in the next one. Take care.